This year, during Women's History Month, a group of women who were the inspiration for Rosie the Riveter were honored with a Congressional Gold Medal. These are best known as the women who put their lives on hold to build tanks and bombers that helped win World War II. But the need for workers to replace the men who went to war extended to truck drivers as well and other areas in the trucking industry. For instance, Maisie Lanham was the first woman hired to drive for UPS in 1943. Women UPS drivers eventually became known as Brown Betties. We've come a long way since then, but there's still room for progress. Women are still vastly outnumbered by men in many trucking industry jobs, from drivers to executive offices. What are the barriers holding them back, and what can trucking companies do to attract and retain more women and support their careers? I'm Deborah Lockridge, editor and associate publisher of HDT Trucking, and we're going to explore this topic with Leah Shaver of the National Transportation Institute. Leah Shaver is president and CEO of the National Transportation Institute. It's started off researching driver compensation, but it's since branched out to include technicians and consulting with motor carriers on driver recruiting and retention. She's been with NTI for 9 years, and before that, she worked in human resources and recruiting and retention for a motor carrier, so she knows a few things about the topic. And we're going to talk today about a recent survey that NTI did about the experiences and challenges encountered by women in the trucking industry, and some ideas on what motor carriers can do to address them. Welcome to HDT Talks Trucking, Leah.
Glad to be here. Good to see you.
So, Leah, you and I have been in this industry for a while. I always joke that the benefit of being a woman in this field was that you didn't have to wait for the bathroom at conventions. Although that is starting to change. What are your personal observations as far as how far the trucking industry has come when it comes to attracting and supporting women, from drivers up to the executive suite?
I think the line issue is probably no longer, right? There's probably a little bit more competition for the ladies' room. Certainly there's been more and more discussion. When NTI started tracking the percentage of women in trucks and in leadership, very few companies were even looking at that data or even had considered examining it. So that old saying, we can't fix what we don't know, simply asking the question allows these companies to look within. More and more women are understanding the opportunities in the industry and seeking them out. And I think that, frankly, I still hear drivers more often referred to as he than I do she in any hypothetical example. And I always want to interject and suggest or she. But nobody wants a party pooper, right? So I try to hold that back until we are suggesting some examples or opportunities of times that she can do this. And to that, I think there's a greater feeling in the public, in view of the industry, in boardrooms and in rooms or audiences or schools, of a greater feeling of I can, or considering that she can do this.
And I think we've seen a lot of discussion about this. I think the past few years we had the pandemic, and which really kind of highlighted some of the challenges drivers in general face, and kind of kicked off some efforts we hadn't seen before on women and in trucking. We've got the task force at the federal level with the DOT. We've got ATA started a new Women in Motion council just recently. So it's definitely something that there's discussion about, which I think is great. So the National Transportation Institute did a survey recently about the experiences and the challenges encountered by women in the trucking industry. What were some of the top takeaways from that survey?
Yeah, Women's History Month, we're a women-owned company, and as you know, I served 6 years on the board of directors of the Women in Trucking Association. focused on membership and growth of opportunities for women. So of course it's a personal issue for me and for our team here at NTI. So we always focus on any concerns of women, about women, for women in the month of March in our survey work and in our materials. So respondents commented on work-life balance, on career advancement, on professional development and mentorship, and what's needed for attracting more women to the industry. And there is where I take you back to the first three. They referenced overwhelmingly work-life balance, career advancement, and professional development and mentorship. So not a whole lot of surprises. However, the granularity and diversity of the response based on the job type is really what stood out to us. Work-life balance impacts folks that are in the truck and in the cubicle or in the office or in the boardroom. Career advancement is important to everyone at all stages of the organization, and they made that very clear and identified both hurdles and ways that companies have come through for them. And then in terms of professional development, a lot of opportunity to see accommodations for women, everything from the clothing to the support to leadership programs, and again, looking at all levels of the industry. I think you've probably seen that, especially in terms of a female driver, the later in her career that she is, the more she starts examining what else will there be for me when I either age out of the truck or wear out of the truck, as is most of what happens to drivers late in their career. They don't typically naturally retire. It's oftentimes an event outside of really of their control or planning. Or they're just really not up to it anymore. And so rather than just going out in style, right, retirement and planned retirement, they oftentimes look at other options. And just in terms of attracting more women, a lot of, again, the other categories: how can we better support and keep women safe? How can we change the expectations of what work-life balance looks like, of what the career path looks like for women and about women? And then just in terms of messaging and what's offered to them, what they'd like to see and how they think it should be delivered.
Anything that surprised you in the survey?
Yeah, I think still to the point that that these issues aren't just a behind the wheel issue, that many women are on leadership tracks or have the potential for career advancement, and the greatest hurdle for them can actually be the personal requirements for them at home and then professionally at work.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, some of this is not exactly new. We've been having conversations for years or even decades about the obstacles and barriers women face in the workplace in general, especially in industries that aren't traditionally ones that attract a lot of women, like trucking. How typically has the trucking industry responded to these kind of barriers in the years you've been working in it?
Well, I think historically the answer was we're either not considering a woman for this role, then I guess this role might not be for her or women in general, or this is the job, we acclimate to the job. And that's actually that's not held exclusively for women. If you think about trucking, how many times in our many years in trucking have we heard, well, that's just the industry, or that's just trucking? And I'm sure we could plug and play any industry in there and hear that outside of ours. But the fact remains that we often ask drivers and women in general to acclimate to the job or agree that it's just the way the industry is.
Yeah, if you want to be home, why are you looking at a job that, may keep you on the road for a week or two at a time?
Yes, ma'am.
And a lot of that has to do, I think, with work-life balance. And you specifically focused on one particular part of that in a blog you wrote, childcare. Talk about some of the issues you heard about that in your survey.
One of the great challenges that I am passionate about, not only now that I am a new mom, but also before working in human resources, having many a discussion with women as they were missing work due to child illnesses or absences from school or from daycare, etc. And also now seeing women approach me looking for mentorship and for guidance because they are on a career path track and they are simply not able to advance because of shift requirements or schedule requirements overall. Location changes that make for an intolerable commute and therefore a schedule problem. So in general, the issue is either access to or lack of childcare, or it's accommodating the schedule and work demands and giving up then availability of childcare or access to attend children's games or events or important dates, just important family events. So, I used to struggle working with employees, and I say struggle meaning I could see the struggle that they had developing a backup plan for their backup plan, because to be frank, that's not always an option.
Right. And it's got to be tougher. And, we talked about this affects everybody, but obviously drivers have some specific things with those longer work days that have got to be make it even more of a challenge.
So let's touch on that. Unpopular opinion, okay? Meaning it's going to be a little punchy, but I don't know that many could disagree. The fact remains that if one wants to become a truck driver, there are very few early entry jobs in the industry that a driver is trained and then goes home at night. It doesn't mean we don't have local jobs. Believe me, we study the different sectors. We know exactly what type of work is available. It doesn't mean that those jobs don't exist. I'm saying that those jobs don't exist for newly licensed, untrained CDL holders. And so, in order to get your training and become a professional driver, you have to put that typically first year or 2 years is very common, especially right now, in over the road, away from home, and oftentimes with a passenger authorization if you qualify for a child that's over the age of 10. So, and really, I should have just said a minimum age requirement of 10 years old. So, I frankly feel that this takes out women in childbearing age for the most part to enter the industry and therefore grow the percentage of women. So my punchy opinion that I think is relatively unpopular, meaning I'm not sure there's a ton of people that really want to change this, is that we're not really going to see significant change to the effect of, look, they're 50% of the population is women, we should see a greater than 10% population in trucks. It's not going to happen until we solve this training requirement that someone is away from home. And then you mentioned schedule, and you're right, local jobs, when I worked in recruiting, oftentimes a driver that was in a local job that was looking to get back over the road said, I get more quality time with my family and doing the things that I need to do and making doctor appointments when I'm working over the road or regional and have set days off than I do with my local job. And why? And we saw this time and again in survey respondents at the NTI survey, because a work day, I'll quote one of the respondents said, a work day that's 14 and a half hours a day makes it absolutely impossible for me to also coincide an important appointment or event. It's just not something that I can do.
Yeah. And so not easy problems necessarily to solve.
Which is why I would say that we haven't seen monumental change in this area. You mentioned earlier that the pandemic, seemed to bring more women into the industry, and that's true. Why? Because we had great demand for more capacity. And the more demand that there is for capacity, the more industry looks outside of what it's always done or doing and says, we need to change this. What else can we do here? So at the moment, there's not great demand for more capacity, right? We
Right.
have surplus capacity. So what's happening? We're not training many new drivers or licensing as many new entrants as we did over the last few years. We're not as focused on the global long-term look of our industry and diversifying age and gender and other populations that we've historically dipped into or sought out when we had a shortage of otherwise qualified drivers. So, when there's great demand, we start to look at some of these alternative options. But today, without that great demand, I don't expect that in any near-term future we're going to see companies taking big strides to be more accommodating in terms of women in childbearing age or child rearing age, to get more out on the road.
What are some things that fleets can do, if they are uh, wisely interested in keeping women and attracting women to help with the child care issue?
Sure. There's four things that we see on the regular. We study pay, we study incentives and bonuses. We also study benefits and work perks. And there are four areas that we typically see, and those are flexible passenger policies. If there are exceptions to be made, that may be one. I have trouble wrapping my head around my toddler next to me in a semi without another caregiver, and sometimes that's a condition. But the bottom line is flexible passenger policies. There are very few, but there are a few that offer alternate roles during pregnancy, and maybe even we would hope that would dip into that early childhood age. And then on-site childcare or a childcare stipend. So recognizing that the first two are we see them every once in a while, and then on-site childcare stipend is a bit of a reach, and not every company can offer that. The other option I'd suggest would be to look within. These teams that are desiring promotion, these folks that are looking to advance in their career path, can that backup plan for your backup plan that I mentioned earlier, coaching employees years ago, can it be developed from within? So the example I'd give you, one of my employees is a soccer mom. I hope she doesn't cringe when she hears me give this example, but she's a soccer mom. In fact, she's recently upgraded to an expedition now called like the child bus. I mean, these things are huge and made for all of this extra equipment. Hockey mom, in fact, she's a hockey mom. But the bottom line is that in these traveling teams, these games that take the family or parts of the family to games that are in long distances away, it seems that the moms, dads, the families provide some backup. So let's say parent one has a kid and parent two has a kid, and they're both in a traveling team. One of the parents takes the kids to the game away from home and is gone for a couple of days, and the other mom and dad are keeping child two with child one, and they've got like a backup plan for their child care. If there's not another family option, you're dipping in with the other hockey moms or soccer moms. So could that type of thing be available within coworkers? Within a workplace, might we have an alternative childcare option, especially if this group of employees all has to do a Saturday rotation? And look, I've had conversations with these women. They're single moms. They live in urban areas. They don't have a huge support network. There's a long commute, and there's not a backup plan for the backup plan. So, I think a reasonable thought might be to even dip into coworker to coworker and see, is there an option there for some flexibility?
That's an interesting idea. Are there fleets out there that are getting this right?
Um, Yes. How could I say no, right? You want to, we want to be encouraging, don't we? There are many that are working at this daily, and let's recognize that change doesn't happen overnight. And the more we improve, the greater room we have to grow. So if we think back, 2016, when we first started asking about the percentage of women in trucks, and companies were like, do people track that? Is that something we're supposed to know? So that surprise is somewhat gone. It's a well popularized and talked about number that companies are tracking. Not all of them like to share it, but people are looking at that. But in terms of childcare and just alternate perks that make the job more attractive, there are companies that are looking to not be like everyone else and come up with great new ideas like a flexible passenger policy. I mentioned I can't even wrap my head around having a young child in the car in the truck, but it is happening. To large companies, especially private fleets that look at options and benefits that they offer internally at the warehouse or in the stores or at a manufacturing site and incorporating them into the transportation team and offering some childcare stipends. So this type of option and opportunity, it is growing, and I'll just say we have a lot more room to grow.
But there is progress, and as you say, even just people being aware of the issue more. It's like, oh, we got any women drivers? I don't know. I'm a Sue over in that terminal, I think. So yeah, I think definitely we're making progress, and lots of fleets, they want to find a way to have a competitive advantage, a differentiator, and seems like that's certainly one way that they could do that when it comes to.
Of course. There are also companies that see this as a competition, right? To the competitive edge thing. There are companies that want to be, Women in Trucking has their best top companies
Right.
for women to work for. There are a lot of folks that want to be included on that. I saw a notice this week from the folks that manage Women in Trucking that one of the conditions to be a top company for women to work for, you have to be tracking how many women are in trucks and in management and in all these other seats. So
it makes sense.
Obviously, they are seeing what we saw years ago, which is that not everybody's tracking it, number one. Not everybody that does track it wants to share it, number two. And that overall, if you want to be a great company for women to work for, that you have to know these numbers and be looking at ways that you can inch them up, even if by small bits.
Every little bit helps, and as you say, you have to be able to know where you are to help figure out where you want to be and how you're going to get there.
Absolutely. And keep in mind that though we focused on opportunities here of room to grow, I take you back to the point that there are so many more women that are aware of opportunities in this industry, not just behind the wheel, but in the office, in management, in leadership, et cetera. So many women see careers in transportation as something that I can do, not that isn't for me. And I think really importantly, so many companies see these jobs as something that she can do or she is doing. So we are seeing growth here and we are seeing improvement. And there's in anything that we're doing better, there's always room to continue to do more.
All right, great. Well, Leah, I think that's all we've got time for today. Thanks for sharing your insights on our podcast, HDT Talks Trucking.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
And for our listeners and viewers, don't forget to subscribe to HDT's YouTube channel or to HDT Talks Trucking on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss an episode.